So, hello and welcome back. So, it's my great pleasure to invite Professor Lo Sang, who is a scholar and he's currently the adjunct associate professor at the Lingnan University Department of Cultural Studies. And his research interest focuses on the historical cultural studies of colonialism, comparative social thought, Hong Kong cultural formation, and citizenship. And he is the author of many books, among which I would just point out Collaborative Colonial Power, The Making of the Hong Kong Chinese, published by the Hong Kong University Press. So thank you so much for joining us, and the floor is yours.
Welcome you all to come to these talks, and this two-day symposium has the theme Perverse Decolonization. So my focus, of course, will be on Hong Kong. I consider my duty is to provide you a more complex background discussion, much more complex than what Yao Jing and Carol have done so well before. Well, as the topic is about perverse colonization, I think it's best to start with the most perverse question Hong Kong is now facing. The most perverse question, of course, is to ask whether Hong Kong is a colony, right? Well, decolonization is good, but it is very difficult to even begin with if the colonial status of the place never been recognized. According to the Chinese official position, Hong Kong return, this word is quite weird, return, or is returned, I would prefer to say, to China on 1997. China has assumed her right to exercise sovereignty of Hong Kong since then. Resuming her right to exercise sovereignty is the word that we first come across in the 80s. We know why this word, this sentence is used. But in all the common use referring to this process, what happened in 1997, the Chinese word for Yugui is used repeatedly. It is a poetic connotation that Hong Kong is returning to the mother's land's fold, or the mother's fold. Right? So this mother-child relationship is the core subject matter. Recently, there has been an official instruction coming from the Education Bureau that the correct expression for all textbook is China resumed to exercise her sovereign right to rule over Hong Kong in 1997. One interpretation why this instruction is issued gave rise to the chance of many people to give their own interpretation. One interpretation is that China has never lost sovereign right of Hong Kong, only that China was usurped by the British power. So somebody suggests that how to refer to the British, the day when the British ruled. They would suggest that the British occupied period. Another interpretation is China has taken down the name of Hong Kong, Macau from the list of colonies of all over the world endorsed by the UN. Therefore, Hong Kong has never been a colony. So this denial of the colonial status of Hong Kong, it happened in the 80s and the 90s, but now we see the emphasis of that we should, at least the school student should follow strictly. Teacher is not allowed to use other expression. For example, Hong Kong took back Hong Kong, China took back Hong Kong, or took back Hong Kong sovereignty, or handover of sovereignty in 1997 is wrong, right? later people, some maverick find out that Deng Xiaoping himself spoke a lot about took back Hong Kong, right? So they change the word and say, well, took back Hong Kong is okay, but took back Hong Kong sovereignty is not okay. Another metaphor to describe the colonial status of Hong Kong is, of course, we can refer to famous sociologist Louis Dialogue in Hong Kong. He used the catchphrase frozen colony to describe what happened in the process of Hong Kong returning to China's fold. What he referred to is that regardless of the different official documents like Sino-British Joint Declaration and all those ideas of one country system and even the basic law are all based on the consensus among PRC, Great Britain, and the Hong Kong people that the colonial system in place before 1997 should be kept intact after 1997. The only changes needed are the national anthem and the national flag, Hong Kong. So for us, the relevant question is whether Huigui has anything to do with decolonization. We've been spending 2 days to talk about. Well, for me, return has nothing to do with decolonization, if Louis Dialogue's metaphor is correct. Has nothing to do with decolonization, a cultural and political analysts normally understand. So during the whole transition period, what was emphasized is so-called smooth transition. That means transfer of power from the old to the new master. Ray Chow, a very famous post-colonialist critic, describes such process as a transition from one colonizer to another colonizer. These descriptions echo with the very common images about how Hong Kong described himself. Well, negatively, you can say, well, caught between two big imperial power, but positively, most people would describe Hong Kong as the place where the East meet the East. So, okay, so Ray Chow's description of transition from one colonizer to another, he supposed that, well, these two masters as colonizer, their status and what they would do, it will be equivalent or similar. But normally, decolonization often achieves through national struggle for independence. If it succeeds, a new political structure for a post-colonial state will be instated. But in 1997, Hong Kong made only minor changes of the whole government so as to make sure that the vested interest in the old regime would be protected. They call it preserving the old ways of life. I can quote an example that illustrates how this decolonization has never been really started. After 1997, the first chief executive, Teng Chi-Wa, had indeed attempted to change the language of the instruction at school. That might be considered as one and the only one attempt to change, to do something about decolonization. But we know that mother tongue education was once independent, but was blocked down in the face of strong opposition from the parent. In the past several decades, preserving British legacy of Hong Kong was celebrated not only by most people in Hong Kong. They say, oh, that's good. After 1997, there is not much thing changed. Nothing changed is a good sign, right? But also been highly praised by Chinese officials. Deputy Prime Minister Li Ruiwan even compared it, the legacy of colonial legacy that the British left is comparable to what the tea stain in the Yixing teapot. That most precious thing should not be easily erased or rubbed off. So I'm going to talk about development of the past. I'm going to offer an account of why these smooth transition and also the transfer of power from one sovereign to another is so smooth. In my book, Collaborative Colonial Power, I describe the operation of the formation of power in Hong Kong as collaborative colonialism. The smooth transition from the British to the Chinese rule is based on the fact that British Hong Kong colonial regime had never tried to impose an alien culture of British identity on Hong Kong, except maintaining the British status of English language. So here you do comparative colonialism, study of comparative colonialism. You can easily point out the characteristic of British rule in Hong Kong is precisely that there had never been what happened in maybe the Spanish experience of imperialism, a kind of erasing or destroyal of the local culture. Here, British has never touched Hong Kong's people's cultural identity. Hong Kong Chinese have been allowed to maintain only their Chinese cultural custom, ritual practices, etc. Hong Kong are even free to develop and contribute to Chinese nationalism and even join the political movement in China. Okay? Quite some Chinese elite in Hong Kong were influential politicians in Qing Empire and Republican government of China. Some of these Chinese collaborators helped to reform the Qing government. Their position could be interpreted as endorsing the continuation of the empire's multiracial inclusive idea of imperial integration. Right? They have to reform, and also it reflects against the background is that Britain also think that the best way to gain benefit from China at that moment was to help Qing dynasty to reform itself into the modern nation state. So send people there, teaching them how to collect tax, right, for example. But some later find out that, well, Qing dynasty is unreformable. They support the Republican Revolution, which was Han-raised, oriented, which at least initially was open to autonomy and federalism. Anyhow, bilingual elite in Hong Kong saw their association with the British power as the cultural capital both in Hong Kong and China. Right? So there is no need to struggle for room to assert their Chinese identity. One day, of course, fancy whether Hong Kong identity was actually bubbling at the same time. Well, recently, some writer with localist inclination tried to interpret that Hong Kong identity was not just emerged in the 70s, as most Hong Kong social and cultural studies scholars agree. They would rather see that, well, back 100 years ago, Hong Kong identity has already emerged, but there is room of debate and argument. But what I try to highlight at this point is that, well, as Chinese identity has not been a problem in Hong Kong, so that to mobilize for the reason of asserting or recovering one's lost identity in a colonial situation has never been an effective factor in Hong Kong to push forward any decolonization movement. The condition for the collaborative colonial rule in Hong Kong was derived from the British colonial principle of indirect rule, especially developed after the Indian Mutiny in 1857. Hong Kong was seated in 1842, not too late after that happened the Indian Mutiny. It further flourished, in particular under Frederick Lu governorship in Hong Kong. He was the most famous figure of championing the principle of colonialism for the British Empire as indirect rule. Okay. The colony then marked itself with the elite preferences for double identity. The in-between status of Hong Kong continued to function even after the rise of the more militant anti-imperialistic Chinese nationalism. That is something that we need to focus on, right? Because the in-between status had never been touched, even though the original condition has changed, right? Now changed to a situation where imperialism became a problem, right? British imperialists been seen as enemy, but even after that, Hong Kong still remained in status. Everybody could see how they can benefit from that situation, that status of Hong Kong. Even after communists took over the mainland, Hong Kong was not reclaimed, although CPC, Communist Party, had anti-imperialism as their ideology. So it caused trouble in the 70s when China argued with the Soviet Russia. Soviet Russia just accused that China has given up their principle. Why you keep Hong Kong not reclaimed? But for Mao Zedong, to keep Hong Kong under the present status is reasonable because well, they describe their policy as long-term consideration and making full use of Hong Kong. 长期打算，充分利用 X word. Because Hong Kong can serve as a window for Communist Party to break Western embargo in Korean War, earning foreign exchange, make contact with Western world, and use Hong Kong as espionage center. That is very common finding from all Hong Kong scholars of Hong Kong study. Chinese cultural nationalism in Hong Kong flourished even in the Cold War period when ideological confrontation between the West and the Communist camp was at its height. So Cold War confrontation has never serious damage of the freedom that Hong Kong Chinese can uphold their patriotic or even or in wider sense Chinese nationalism. 1967 is a testing era. The left-wing riots stimulated anti-communist sentiment in Hong Kong. Hong Kong identity and developed gradually after that. Yet the Chinese nationalism, not necessarily loyal to Beijing, maintained and kept on. And even in 1989, amidst widespread fear in face of the Beijing massacre, for millions of Hong Kong people took to the street chanting patriotic slogan. Chinese identity grew even stronger than before. So you see the overwhelming influence of Chinese nationalism in Hong Kong has never been seriously shaken. Now I want to discuss a few concepts before we carry on to introduce Hong Kong's background. Is the discussion the use of a number of post-colonial terms. I think one has to make distinction between anti-colonialism, post-colonialism, and decolonization. For me, anti-colonialism or anti-imperialism is based on a model or dichotomy between colonial power and the colonized. In all anti-colonial discourse, logic of reversal entail. That means you successfully overthrow the colonizer and let the colonized regain their autonomy, then is a successful anti-colonial struggle. Nationalism is a correlate of this anti-colonial struggle. Independence is the goal of nationalism. But post-colonialism as a concept focuses more on the ambiguity of the effect and the impact of colonial rule and the dilemma post-colonial usually face. For example, the loss of original, authentic, native identity and the rise of new post-colonial identities, which make the model of nation-state difficult to fit. The third concept, the core concept, the decolonization. Decolonization for me is an ambiguous word. Sometimes refer to the process of completing anti-colonial struggle, but sometimes it also refers to the project of overcoming new colonialism in the post-colonial period. Decolonization, according to conventional mainstream political science, decolonization should be defined as reassertion of the subjecthood of the colonized subject. Politically, it gives them the right to have self-determination. Economically, the exploitative economy should be reformed to gain autonomy. Culturally, the colonized people should be allowed to refashion an identity of their own through nationalist struggle. Fanon described why nationalism is an essential part for the colonized to assert their own identity. So if you take that as a entry point as to consider Hong Kong decolonization, the case is Hong Kong was deprived of the opportunity to develop a nationalist struggle for independence of its own for very obvious reasons. The rise of Chinese nationalism overshadowed any attempt to seek for reform of the colonial structure of Hong Kong and the development of Hong Kong identity. Well, that is a tricky thing, right? If you see nationalism usually as a very powerful, at least if you consider China as our subject matter, then Chinese nationalism, of course, has overthrown imperialist power and turned that semi-colony into now an independent country. But China's policy toward Hong Kong has created different effects. The rise of Chinese nationalism forbid the change of with colonial structure of Hong Kong and as well as the development of Hong Kong identity. I give you an example when I look into the very famous, maybe the only decolonization campaign happened after the '67 riot and when Hong Kong entered into the late '60s and the '70s. We usually call that period as the red period. Well, the first campaign that is closely related to decolonization is that the campaign for the official status of Chinese language to be recognized by the government to use Chinese language in the official document. It was genuinely a decolonization movement, which was couched in certain Chinese nationalistic discourse. You have to justify why you love Chinese so much, right? Why you refuse to live under a government who issued to you only English document, and all the law is vetted in English. Yet the CPC, Communist Party leftists, opposed the movement. You see the tricky relationship between the Communist Party and Chinese nationalism. They opposed the movement because in their eye the campaign was breeding Hong Kong independence or to beautify the colonial government. Okay, because the people who raised this issue, who campaigned for that, first of all, is coming from some well-known people's representatives, though not popularly elected, but they are very well-known Chinese leaders in the community. And on the other hand, there is some group with different ideology. They come back from Australia or Britain learning Trotskyism and so on and so forth. Well, they jointly come to campaign for Chinese language. The Maoist leftists opposed initially, that is. Right? After 2 years, they changed the tone. They changed the way to deal with it. So the question for me is whether Chinese nationalism is really decolonizing. Whether Chinese nationalism is committed to the value and spirit of decolonization. I would like to periodize the change of that relationship. In early Republic China, Chinese nationalists were an offspring of collaborative colonialism. Right? We just explained that. After the May 4 movement in 1919, Chinese nationalism became revolutionary. Certainly the rhetoric and also the principle of this nationalism is closely linked with anti-imperialism. You can find that revolutionary spirit in both KMT and CPC. But from 1949 to 2008, in Hong Kong, collaboration continued under the principle of making full use of Hong Kong and long-term planning, continue in the name of Chinese nationalism, except the brief period of 67 riot organized by the leftist trade union. After that, after the failure of that riot, they go back to the same policy of actually facilitating the continuation of this collaborative colonialism. And in 1997, what is most important is that we face the issue of, well, having returned, right? But my book also has a chapter to analyze this, well, in Yao Jing's presentation, maybe called self-colonization. I see, well, you can describe that, but I rather use the concept of indigenization of colonial power. This indigenization of colonial power refer to the process in which the scholar in Hong Kong, they are very eager to contribute the idea of how to arrange politically in Hong Kong after 1997. And they, what they try most to do is to, well, see how colonialism make Hong Kong so prosperous. So trying to distill the colonial experience and consider it as, well, it offers a model. If Hong Kong deviates from that model, then Hong Kong may fail. Hong Kong will not maintain its prosperity and stability. So they transform that into a kind of principle that, well, that is colonialism. Well, my argument is, when this indigenization of colonial power is done, then, well, anybody can also use that kind of so-called colonial technique, right? Okay, China rise after 1997, well, until 2008, the China rise triggered the revival of the ideal empire. I will elaborate later. Well, I was asked to join this symposium to discuss about perverse decolonization. I read the abstract, and in that abstract, well, it pointed out the pitfall of post-colonial theory or post-colonialism. One of the problems that we are now facing today is the rise of nationalism of different kind, implying that we should be self-critical about the role post-colonialism play in the rise of nationalism. So I keep on reflecting upon this connection, because in the 90s, I belonged to a group of young scholars contributing our effort to edit book and producing a number of publications, and a number of artists who had been inspired by that, and that post-colonialism being effective in that period. Now we have to look back. Post-colonialism created the effect of nationalist anti-colonial struggle. The building of new independent nation-states are still subjected to new colonialism. Exclusively of the nation-state model also create more problematic issues with regard to cultural identity, like ethnic rivalry, racism, that it's still being found in nationalism. That means it contributes post-colonialism, clearly the nation-state model. In Chatterjee's work, Homi Bhabha's work, they all challenge the legitimacy of the nation-state model. In Spivak and Chen Chao, there was strong criticism against nativism, especially Wei Chao. She see that as the root of nationalism and nativist notion of cultural authenticity. Most of us are interested in reading the work and produce Hong Kong post-colonial discourses. It developed in the academy and the cultural circle in the 80s and 90s. Post-colonialism helped to articulate Hong Kong identity with emphasis on the city's cosmopolitanism that stand against chauvinistic Chinese nationalism. Everybody have that fear, especially after the June 4 in 1989, happened there. It's carrying strong. This Chinese nationalism asserted to be carrying with strong anti-colonial, anti-imperial rhetoric. You can read from world, 主要位啊羅貴祥, they put emphasis on cosmopolitanism. However, postcolonialism developed in the 1980s also carries self-critical orientation against the sense of Hong Kong's superiority over and against the bedrock Chinese. Writing like from by Yu Yam-chung or Hong Ho-feng at that moment at least is very critical of Hong Kong jingoism. Right? In this era, Hong Kong post-colonial criticism did not take British colonial legacy as worth examining. That is something that after 2 decades, we know that, well, yes, that is something that may not have been done enough. But localism, Yao Jing has a very good presentation of the perverse aspect of localism. Right? I would prefer to call that the right-wing populist, much more than very committed localist. There is a connection between this colloquialism and post-colonialism. Reason why the Hong Kong localism is strong anti-immigrant orientation follow anti-colonial logic, treating China as new colonizer carrying with it the alleged project to colonize Hong Kong. Well, somehow it derived from how they read Ray Chow, right? Ray Chow said from Hong Kong's been handed over from one colonizer to another colonizer. But they feel very uneasy about post-colonial discourses as a whole, because post-colonial discourses attack or even query fundamentally about the legitimacy of nationalism or nation-state model. But what they consider is something else. They assert that the only effective response against the colonizing power that in China is to develop Hong Kong nationalism. So they criticize people like me and saying that, oh, you still keep on talking about these post-colonial discourses and criticizing nationalism, but need nationalism now. They criticize post-colonialism as a weak and powerless response because they assert too much Hong Kong openness, celebrating cosmopolitanism that city cannot afford. It pertains only to the middle-class view of the city. Cosmopolitanism is not something that we should celebrate. Because it detached from the grassroots. You don't know the grassroots people's suffering in face of the flooding mainland immigrant in China. So, if I may give an overall account for what post-colonialism in Hong Kong, is that it has never facilitated Chinese nationalism nor the Hong Kong nationalism newly developed, although the notion of Hong Kong identity is derived to a certain extent from post-colonialism. You see, 90 is a period where Hong Kong identity became gradually mature. But of course, localism, when they take this anti-colonial model to criticize China, they also bypass examining the legacy and the future effect of British colonial past. Okay, that is one aspect to look at local decolonization. How about the ruling regime? Whether they have a project of decolonization? Given that there is a policy of denying Hong Kong being a colony, it's arguable whether the ruling regime in Hong Kong has harbored a notion of decolonization. At least not until the rise of more assertive notion of China rise, right? But the sense of discontent about the lack of Hong Kong loyalty grew ever stronger after 2003 rebellious massive demonstration against national security deal. The word decolonization is somehow avoided, but the project of instilling patriotism. This patriotism has to be redefined, much more than what most Hong Kong before would identify. They claim themselves as identifying with Chinese culture or history, but now when patriotism is invoked, they are referring to an attitude of loyalty and obedience. Okay? This decolonizing project, without the name, is implemented. It supports conservatism in Hong Kong. Why you ask for democracy after return, but not in British colonial time? Of course, it is a violation of history because, before under British rule, there were call for decolonization, although in a much weaker manner. But this phase, why you ask for democracy after Britain, but not in British colonial time, is so common. You can capture the mood of the conservative idea. Now, to deny Hong Kong democratic right regime also pit democracy against stability and prosperity. You can choose either one. Liberalism are treated as Trojan horse of Western imperialists to subvert China's sovereign right to rule over Hong Kong. But previously, this kind of attacking, in principle, liberalism and democracy, I mean, you could hardly find in the first decades of after 1997. But nowadays, even the conservative or the Western interests, the people with vested interest, could say that because they now has the room to join in and to erase their past as somehow unpatriotic, themselves as pro-British at that time, and now they come to say, well, the Western thing is not our thing. We don't want this. What makes perverse thing most obvious is somehow the attitude of the Chinese official. Chinese officials has never stopped to fancy themselves as a competent imperial power as the predecessor. There's a kind of desire to learn from the British how to lead a place like Hong Kong, right? How to make it successful. I cite a speech by the new head of the liaison office just come to Hong Kong. He said, China has for the past year suffered from radicalism of all sorts. Hong Kong should not follow our failed model. Staging radicalism like the Cultural Revolution. Hong Kong should cherish the most precious British legacy of conservatism. Only the spirit of conservatism can make Hong Kong possible. So it's very explicit. You might when he write that in the magazine have very high status in Beijing. He provoked even the Hong Kong the most core local leftists, Zhang Yuksen. How come you could say this thing? Isn't it not a kind of a colonial nostalgia? They've been always accused people who oppose Beijing policy to Hong Kong as having colonial nostalgia. But here you see more vivid example of what colonial nostalgia. Okay, things change, right? Things change. When we see that in Hong Kong, the difficulty of really launching the decolonization, why within the past 10 years, given the background of the so-called China's rise, is of course a change not just happened in Hong Kong, but in China itself. China become a superpower, and then it also changed its outlook. What I'm going to briefly talk about here is from the history of thought, point of view, to identify several trends that indicated a shift of mentality and even ruling ideology in China. Over the past decade, leading Chinese intellectuals have huge interest in the revival of traditional political thought. Of course, they wouldn't be that much interested in Marxism, Leninism, but they are very much interested in several topics. One of them is so-called traditional Chinese political thought. It's an attempt to reconceptualize China not as a nation state, but as an empire or civilizational state. So the change for knowledgeable Hong Kong patriot or people who sympathize with China, the shock for them is, well, China has changed. The meaning of patriotism has changed. Whereas previously, I can show my patriotic feeling and people, well, recognize. You have to recognize the people who join the June 4 commemoration annually held in Hong Kong is a kind of patriotism. Okay, the Beijing government had never launched big campaign to say that these people are unpatriotic, but they are patriotic in a different way. But now here, for Chinese nationalism, face a new reality, because China is turning toward having a tendency, even reject themselves as being described as a nation state. They consider that the nation state is something that, well, they impose a European model. Chinese government strategies, I mean, not just intellectual, but they have close connection with government policy making, are eager to compare the style and skill and artistry of imperial rule among different empires. You can read from a writer like Qiang Xigong. Well, he on the one hand been very competent about Carl Schmitt, Nazist constitutional thought, but on the other hand he praised, well, Confucianism, and see Hong Kong as an example to demonstrate Deng Xiaoping not only embody his wisdom, his political wisdom, but actually, well, is actually following the principle of how Qing dynasty deal with the coastal region or the border region. The concept of Tianxia, the Chinese idea of imperial rule, is widely celebrated as an alternative to the Western imperialism. It offers a new model. It's more considered as more benevolent, inclusive, harmonious, and less violence, because most would agree upon this assumption. Because Hong Kong, Chinese idea of Tianxia is based not on monotheism. So Chinese civilization, a better civilization than European civilization. They trying to receive China's own imperial legacy inherited from the Qing dynasty. Qing dynasty is described as a successful empire. It's a multicultural empire ruled by the Manchurian. So the importance of this retrieval of traditional thought, particularly you can find from political Confucianism. Confucianism in Hong Kong, many people, many students in the 50s, 60s, studying in Chinese university would know the legacy and the importance of New Confucianism in Hong Kong. They were anti-communist scholars. But of course, over the past few decades, a lot of people in mainland China embrace Confucianism. First of all, as a kind of new sources they can think about what China is, right? What kind of culture. They initially share with these Confucian scholars teaching from their perspective to reflect upon what gone wrong in communist China. But later, you see, some people suggest that, well, that kind of Confucianist scholarship is not useful. The most useful thing is to turn Confucianist ideas into political practices. Because it informs the formation of empire, formation of different dynasties. The ideal empire was treated by many strategies in new and better principle for global polity than the imperialism empire nation state could play. Political Confucianists contribute a great deal to the revival of this traditional political thought. Some also insist on instating a state religion like Shintoism in Japan, repeating the failed Wei Xin abandoned when Qixi killed the reformists. Other ideas include reforming the present Chinese government according to the classical Chinese structure of government. You see, even they suggest how to reform the government. Right? We don't need to follow the Western model of bicameralism, but a tricameralism, constituted of the chamber with popularly elected representative, good, if it's introduction of democracy, but also counterbalanced by a chamber appointed and selected by Confucian scholar, and another chapter of noble or religious leader appointed and selected. The chairman is headed by the descendant of the Confucius family. You know, the revival of this mythic authority of Confucianism underpin this cultural revival. And of course, I don't have time to elaborate on the different trend of current China's political thought, but somehow it fit to the post-colonial anxiety about, well, when somebody suggested, well, to get away from the impasse of the now post-colonial discourse facing, we need to search for alternative universalism. Their answer they give back to in response to this question is, oh, we have a universalism, our own universalism. Is well, my question is, does it mean that we need an empire to thoroughly decolonize? Okay, or we need an empire to end all empires? Okay, different school of thought compete for the attention of the central authority. Well, Xi Jinping come to select. He come out as a kind of a hybrid. Okay, they re-emphasize that. Well, not only in the early period of communist struggling, we could witness a so-called a Confucianization of Marxism. Back to the 80s, many scholars talk about that. Mao Zedong was not really a Marxist, but he was indeed a practice in a Confucian way. Right? At that moment, Li Jiaho, people like him suggest that, well, we have to witness the Confucianization of Marxism. But it is about the past. Now, Communist Party will come on and say that. Well, yes, what we now to do is the second phase of Confucianization of Marxism. Political Confucian is believed to be the most radical attempt to complete the decolonization of Western Germany, which has long been sabotaging the great Chinese civilization. They embrace the traditional practice and idea of Chinese civilization necessary for the Chinese to strip off the jacket of Western idea, theory, so on and so forth. So they get rid of democracy and liberalism, human rights, etc. Concept principle of political Confucianists have been selectively appropriated by Communist Party. The revival of this political traditionalism is couched in the term Confucianization or Marxism. So recently, when people celebrate Karl Marx's 20th year anniversary, Karl Marx was commemorated as a classical sage figure. Sage, well, good person, producing good things, morally great. Right? Okay, Xi Jinping's rule, he appropriated Mao's rhetoric practices in past, discourse of anti-imperialism and anti-colonialism, of course, become fashionable now again. And this cultural revivalism emerged and developed in the name of decolonization. Anything directly symbolizing the rise of Western modernity, like Mayfair movement. Mayfair movement commitment to modernity is now denounced or trying to be rewritten. Feudalism is no longer an issue to fight against. So, well, feudalism as a word can disappear. In Hong Kong, let's go back to Hong Kong. Right? In Hong Kong, this trend allows some loyalists to suggest to the government to clear the remnant of British colonial era by removing the sign of colonialism, such as the mailpost, the icon of crown, or by renaming the street and road. A school-level textbook of censoring political incorrect expression, historical event has given you political correct meaning. And well, you can point to example like government-organized event to commemorate May 4 would be so perverse as to commemorate not democracy, patriotism, liberty, all these words, but, well, we come to see the essence of May 4 movement is cultural harmony, inclusiveness, and sympathy. It happened. Right? Another is, well, At the university, local intellectual against government have been denied promotion in non-publicly in state media, so as to radically influences the Western doctrine of liberalism that have been both considered as poisoning youngster mind. Are they decolonization what we want? Okay, I want to analyze here.
Thank you so much for your presentation. Thank you, and I'm sure we're going to go back to all the different discussions about Hong Kong in the panels afterwards. But I would like first to invite the last speaker of the day, Pablo Lafuente, who is an educator, curator, and writer based in Rio de Janeiro, who is interested in horizontal approaches to organization and to pedagogy, recently in connection with indigenous struggles in Brazil. And yeah, until 2013 he was an editor of the After All journal in London and curator of the Office for Contemporary Art in Norway, in Oslo. Thank you, Pablo.
Thank you. Thanks first to Cosmin and Parasite for bringing me here. It's a very long way, and thanks to all of you for staying here until now. It's also a long day. I'm going to try to be brief, but I don't know if I can be light, because it's not a light issue. I mean, it's a completely different geography. You know? So I don't know how much you know about Brazil, but I thought I'd start with three bits of data. The first one is about the independence of Brazil. I don't know if, I mean, I think it's a really peculiar process of national independence. The Portuguese Empire Court moved to Rio from Portugal in 1807, I think. No, they moved before, because of the, I think maybe 15. Napoleon was arriving in Portugal, the Napoleon troops, and then the court, Dom João, moved to Brazil. A few years later, in the 20s, there was a liberal uprising in Portugal, so Dom João decided to move back the court and left his son, Dom Pedro, as the regent prince. When he got to Portugal, he couldn't fight off the liberal uprising, so he decided as the king to bring the court back officially to Lisbon and declared again Brazil a colony. And the son said no, had become independent. So weirdly, the independence of Brazil is a family failed. And this is interesting for many reasons. The second one, I mean, Brazil, just basic geography. Brazil is almost as big in extension as China. It has 220 million people, which is big by the standards of general countries, but it's also not that big considering the huge size of it. Third, democracy. I mean, I was thinking of that. I mean, I wasn't thinking of talking about that, but I thought of talking about that when you were talking about the China and democracy and stuff. Brazil has, I mean, has now has a government that is the result of an administrative coup d'état for the last 3 years already. For 3 years, with no condemnation from any international instance. The UN or whatever, and condemnations from 3 or 4 presidents in the world. The police in Rio de Janeiro last year killed 1,000 people. That's normal. That's usual. No? And you know, it's not the Rio de Janeiro police who kills people. All the police kill people. And the structural corruption in Brazil is insane. And the Human Development Index ranges from Sweden level to Congo level in the same city very often. And this is a democracy. This is a democratic country since 1985. The constitution is from 1988. So I'm going to talk about indigenous struggles that I've accompanied and engaged with in Brazil in recent times. And why am I talking about that? I'm talking about that because of this proposal of a topic of decolonization processes. I mean, these indigenous struggles are decolonization processes, if you want to call it that. It's a term that actually most of them don't use, because most of these struggles are not used based on theory or academic or writings written anywhere actually. Though some of these people now are going to university, studying law, and maybe reading Fanon. But there are struggles that are being made without recourse to ideas of nation. And it's interesting, I guess, if you look at Canada, for example, indigenous fights are made with recourse to the idea of First Nations. This type of construction is not used in Brazil or in Mexico, for example. I mean, these things are very different in every country. And these struggles have been made using structures and misusing structures and fighting against structures and platforms and methods and methodologies and ways that are inherited from the colonization process that began in Brazil in 1500 when Cabral arrived in the coasts of Bahia. So I'm going to talk about how some of these people are using different structures or not, and what effects this may have. And I don't have a particular reading. I think that it's interesting to look at how things come together or not. I thought I was starting with these two pictures. The guy on the top is Mario Juruna. He's until now the only member of Congress in Brazil ever from indigenous background. He was early 80s. He was responsible for creating the Permanent Commission of Indigenous People in the Congress. He was famous because he was the first, and I think the only Brazilian politician to denounce a bribe that he was offered. This is amazing. And he was fundamental in the contribution to the chapter of the Constitution from '88 that talks about indigenous rights, which is one of the most advanced, most sophisticated constitutions in general, but also constitutions in relation to indigenous rights in the world. The Constitution declares the right of indigenous people to originary lands and the obligation of the government to guarantee that, as well as other obligations in terms of language and culture and ways of living, none of which the government has implemented properly since 1988. Maria Zuna used to go around recording everything because white people lie, so you have to record them. I think that's super interesting. You can't trust written. You have to record their voices because it's the voice that carries the promise, and the promise has to be enacted. But Maria Zuruna, after years of working in politics and leaving not being re-elected in 87, 88, he never got back to his people. He never got back to his community. The community would not take him back. But he couldn't find a place there. So he basically remained the rest of his life in Brasilia. So there was something that happened that kind of made him go out into a different world that didn't allow him to come back to the world that he was actually fighting for. The person below is Sonia Guajajara. She's currently a candidate for the presidency in Brazil with a small leftist party. It's a double candidacy. It's a guy who's a leader of the homeless, the urban homeless movement. It's the movement of the workers without a roof. And he and her are the co-candidates for a ticket and the elections are supposed to happen in November if they do happen. And I mean, it may be that they get something around 5-10% of the votes, but somehow seeing a woman with that outfit, with that tone of skin, you could see them, but not in that context. Right now is actually some kind of a strange development and a really interesting development. I was just going to say it's the Congress of Brazil, I think is, I can't remember, but I think it's 75% male and 90%, 95% white, while Brazil is hard, but it's like around 60% black, and then different levels of, there's also a big Japanese community and whatever. So I mean, I'm using this thing because these two people show an engagement with the structure which is not originary from the people who are engaging with it. But at the same time, it kind of brings in a few problems about what are the right ways of being what you are, and what are the right ways of doing what you are supposed to be, which brings in notions of identity and types of practice. This may be more clear with this example. This is an image of the expulsion of the occupants of the Aldea Maracanã. This is in Rio, next to the Maracanã Stadium. This building was a building donated by a duke to the Indigenous Foundation in the 1910s, and then it became the Museum of the Indigenous, the Indian Museum. I mean, words are really funny here, well, not funny, but and then it became disoccupied, and then in 2006 it became an urban, multi-ethnic village, which was also an occupation, basically. A group of indigenous people living in the city occupied it and reclaimed it. This was a donation to the indigenous cause. We have to take care of it, we have to organize it, we have to make it a living place, which means a living place for culture, for politics too. After 6-7 years, when the World Cup was coming and they had to get Maracanã ready for the World Cup, they decided to expel them. And there's fantastic images in the sense of the contrast of military police, this military police that kills 1,000 people in Rio per year, beating up the indigenous people to kick them out of this building, which had to be refurbished to get it ready, the complex for the World Cup. But out of this expulsion, two different groups came out. The cacique is the head, the leader, chief. The cacique of the Aldea with a big group of people who made an agreement with the governor, completely corrupt governor, that's normal, to rehouse the people from there and get a promise for a refurbishment of this building and concession to use it after the World Cup. Another group decided that they were that it wasn't right to actually collaborate or negotiate with corrupt white power structures and remained for longer, and these people were the ones who were actually beaten up by the police and expelled with tear gas. Since then, there has been a verbal but also political standoff between these two groups. And the discussions are super interesting. Well, the second group would have maybe like a political position that is very similar to anti-globalization movements, resistance, non-collaboration, anti-capitalism, and also collaborative or an openness to foreign agents and discourses to create pressure on the local scene. The other group adopts something that they themselves call more indigenous, which is a more collaborative, more consensual practice that fights through intense dedication to negotiation, which which is something that indigenous people today in Brazil recognize as their own, but it's something that maybe wasn't the case 300 years ago. I didn't say this, but in Brazil right now there are 300 indigenous peoples, 300 different indigenous people, 270 languages. The sizes are very different. There's like the Guarani, there's like 50,000 of them. There's in total, in theory, 1 million indigenous people. There's groups that are like 200 people. There's groups that are 50,000, 60,000. And some of them have histories of strong resistance. Some of them have histories of less resistance, and none of this is to be judged as to why. But what is interesting here is that this confrontation, I think I want to make the point clear that two ways of being indigenous and two ways of doing politics from the indigenous standpoint were being confronted, which brings the question of what does it mean to be indigenous. And this is something that in Brazil is quite complex. I think every place has its complexities. No? The government, through this constitution, recognizes that in order to be indigenous, two things have to happen. This is super interesting, I think. This is not the case, for example, in Ecuador or Bolivia. You have to self-declare as indigenous, and the community has to recognize him as part of that community. This is super interesting because, and we were talking yesterday about, self-identifying as black. I mean, these things are today, there's countries where the drop of blood is enough. There's countries where that is not enough, where, whitening is a process that makes you not belong. But in Brazil, the community, the indigenous community has to allow it, which has sometimes difficult situations when somebody is the son of two indigenous people from two different communities. They may not be recognized by any of the communities. So you are not, you can't call yourself indigenous anymore. This also is something that creates administrative problems, and it also creates, I think some frictions within some communities, but I think that somehow focusing on that, first, I think that it makes sense to do that if you are trying to resist a process of whitening of 500 years, in which mixtures, slavery, forced marriages, rape, displacements of land were used to actually whiten populations, mix them up, and make them lose their cultural practice habits. I mean, if you are in a land that has a certain type of conditions and you actually live from the things in the land, and you use the things in the land to cure yourself, and to eat, and to live, and to enjoy yourself, and you're displaced to another place, you lose all this, so you have to come rebuild it. No? So, in some way, this type of community definitions of who belongs to the community or not, I think strategies in order to kind of like keep that going. Oops, lost there. In some way, this is also related to a process which is happening in Brazil today after those 500 years of some indigenous groups recovering what was lost, which relates to these ideas of a certain type of originality or purity or of reconstruction of identities that somehow were lost. And at the same time, that results in really interesting processes. For example, the Pataço. The Pataço are people from the coast of Bahia where Cabral arrived. I lived there for 2 years and I used to frequent some of the villages. So the Pataço were the first to contact the Portuguese, or the first to be invaded by the Portuguese. The Pataço have villages that receive tourists. And so some of these guys that you see there, they may be wearing something similar to what I wear to go to work, which is jeans or shorts and a vest. They may be wearing this for ceremonies, but they may be wearing this for tourists to make money of them. At the same time, they didn't wear this 20 years ago, because 20 years ago they were basically too scared to wear that. They wouldn't get anywhere wearing that. In some way, they would be working, not in this region, for some personal reason, they would be working as seringueiros, as rubber extractors, the people who collect rubber from the trees. And they would be completely incorporated within a white Brazilian context, and they would actually not speak the language. The language of the Pataço, Pachoha, is being at the moment reconstructed, and it's being reconstructed by Pataço people using the language of other neighboring peoples, using some of the remains of memories of the older people, and using also Yoruba words, Yorubas in West African words that have been, after 500 years of colonial and slavery, have been incorporated within the communities. And all that on top of a Portuguese grammar. But this is Pachoha, this is Pataço language. And this is what they are using in order to actually construct or reconstruct the notion of peoples that they want to have. There was something else that I was talking to somebody from another indigenous people, told me, we were in this gathering, and they said, but look at this, look at the young people, how beautiful they are. The body paint is traditionally many indigenous peoples and also was lost, and in some of them not. And the body paint is not about representation, most of them, it's not symbolic. Mostly it's about having an effect. Because if you trace lines in your body, you make your body more permeable, for example. Some of them are about communication, some of them are about effects on transformation of your body. But they are not being, they wouldn't be used to spend the day painted necessarily, or to show it to somebody else. But currently in Brazil, some of the practices of wearing feathers, painting your body, are a way to convince yourself that your body, your indigenous body, is a beautiful body. Because the indigenous body, through the process of white colonization, became the ugly body. It's not a desirable body, and you don't want to look indigenous. This is a process of, if you go to the north of Brazil, Belém, for example, Pará, many people will have an indigenous, which there's many different ways of being indigenous, different facial structures, but the skin color is darker. It's darker red, darker brown. The historical process means that most people who would look indigenous wouldn't recognize themselves as that, because the association is something that is not nice. It's not nice to look at. It's marginalized, but it's also about actually almost like a self-perception of beauty is recuperated as a tool to fight against annihilation, against erasure. All these strategies are about mostly focused on the recovery of lands. No? The recovery of land as a place where you can be what you want to be, and for that, the strategies have been mostly of two kinds: legal strategies, trying to implement the rights recognized in the Constitution, but also paralegal structures, occupations, and forced occupations of land, and blockages, and these two types of operation demand a knowledge of the laws of the whites. So what's happened very strongly in the last few years is younger indigenous people going to college, going to universities, in order to actually be able to argue with the voice of the whites about the laws of the whites. At the same time, that's not necessarily accepted for everybody. One of the Patsohag chiefs, Pataso chiefs in the area, when the university was open there 4 years ago, they said that he didn't want his people to go to the whites university because you end up thinking like the whites, you end up processing like the whites, you end up creating a process of learning and of communication and of writing that the white people have, and you lose your own. So what he wanted is for the state to pay for a university to be created by them in the way they want to be created. And this tension is unresolved, basically. The two approaches are happening every day. In relation to this, I was thinking of something that Katia said about change. And it's important to say that all the indigenous struggle in Brazil doesn't reclaim change at all. What they want to do is take away, it's not about changing conditions. There's an interesting discourse in relation to indigeneity and poverty. What the state did, the colonial state did with them, is try to declare the indigenous as poor in order to take them out of the poverty and stop them from being indigenous. If you declare somebody who lives in the middle of the forest, who lives off basically a bit of fish and a bit of hunting, if you declare them as unable to provide for themselves because you move them from a place to another, and you declare them poor, you actually take away from them the agency to remain on the space that they are, and the state can implement on them practices to, send some doctors, and maybe just, move some of them from the place, give them a job, give them a bit of money, introduce money into the village, introduce loans, and continue to destroy the types of structures that they've had for thousands of years. And the fight is not about, they don't want to change the condition, they want to stop the invasion that continually happens every 500 years, which is very different from the logic of the left in Europe. I think that's something that I think Balibar wrote something about it once, which was something about, let's think about why change is almost like the Bible of the left. And I think, it sounded to me really intuitively right. I mean, there's something about the European left in which change against, conditions is something that is change against unfair conditions is something that is like, the desire, no? Or the motor of politics and history. While for the indigenous people in Brazil, I know, it's not about change, it's about get out of my way. Stop coming in, stop sending me the diseases, stop taking away my lands, stop polluting my rivers, get out of my space, get out of my, or even come into my space if you want, but on my conditions, under my negotiation, under my rules. This is the political aspect, and connecting to this self-representation, self-building of an image. I want to talk a bit about art, culture. More about culture than art, but also about art. In recent years, the indigenous struggle in Brazil also has had a bit of more attention from the intellectual urban left, which is a good thing, because nobody paid attention to it before, but now more people are paying attention to it. And this Sonia Guajajara coming in as the candidate for PSOL is one of these, it symbolizes that. Which also has meant that, well-intentioned curatorial, endeavors and museums have decided to work with indigenous cause. Which has meant exhibitions or conferences in big museums like MASPI, SESCI, or the PS.ARCHIVE, in which curators have curated exhibitions with non-indigenous artists talking about how terrible the situation of indigenous peoples are. And without, surprisingly, and without much concern about that way of approaching things. It's as if these people could not talk, could not make films. I'll be faster. It's as if they could not talk, they could not make films, they couldn't articulate, they couldn't make objects, they couldn't speak, they couldn't write. And in response to this, some of us, indigenous, organized this meeting for 2 days, in which 30 people from the whole country gathered to talk about what was going on and how this could be tackled. Something interesting, I don't know if it's interesting or not, but to bring some of these people to Sao Paulo took, I think the same amount of money that costed my ticket from Mangalore to here, and took more or less a day and a half, 2 days. Traveling from some regions of Brazil to Sao Paulo takes twice the amount of time that takes me from coming from Rio to Hong Kong. And I think that's interesting. Some of these people speak a Portuguese which is much worse than our English. Some of them in other places don't speak any Portuguese. Some of them have ways of engaging with language and discourse and exchange and speaking which has nothing to do or very little to do with the ways that some of them may want to sing, or some of them may not want to pronounce themselves individually, they want to pronounce themselves as groups. But anyway, this gathering happened, and this gathering in which some people, like especially the whites, including me, were concerned about these museums taking advantage and co-opting and misusing, as museums do. Some of you work in the contemporary art context. The working conditions for those working in the contemporary context is not that great. They are not that great anyway. Imagine, what's the concern? Imagine if they invite somebody who has even less negotiating ability because they don't know the mechanisms of the rules and they don't know the language, and they may, think that it's an opportunity when they are being exploited, and nobody has there to argue for a fee. Also because we were concerned that some of the art as an institution is a Western construct that still is attached to ideas of authorship, individual authorship, attachment to the object. You have to have something, certain ideas of value, ideas of circulation, and other issues that that the contemporary art has been trying to get away from, but it doesn't manage to. The surprise, or not surprise, is that the people gathered in the room had very different positions, from people who want to be artists. So I want to be an artist, I'm an artist, and I represent the culture of my people. It's a process very delicate, and this Jader Bell is a Mukusi guy, to artists making something that is appropriation of Western languages, to question what it means, what it may mean to be indigenous, to collectives. For example, this collective is from Acre, on the border with Peru. Junikuin, they are one of the peoples who take ayahuasca, and this is a collective of artists, a collective that makes paintings based on not on the visions of ayahuasca, but on the singing that accompanies ayahuasca. And they operate as a collective, which is a declaration of the fact that the art is not made by individuals, but for them, and this is something that they articulate clearly politically, for them being artists is what allows them not to be poor workers or enslaved workers. It's a way out. Art is a way out for them to not, a way out of being exploited seringueiros, rubber collectors. No? All of this, somehow made me think of, makes me think, it made me really think, but it makes me think of, how can you actually legislate on what position is right? And actually some people are trying to get in the museum. Some people don't care if the museum is doing whatever it wants to. Some people want to be artists. Some people don't want to be artists. Some people are saying the work of art, that the film has to be signed by the whole community who is in the film. So the film has to be signed by the children of the community who are in the film too. All these things are happening at the same time. I don't think I have a recipe. There was this project that we curated together, some communities from Rio with me and other indigenous people. But I don't want to talk about that. If there's 2 minutes, I'll talk about this, which I think is more interesting. This is 2 pictures of the Maxacali region. Maxacalis are on the border of Minas Gerais with Bahia. They were displaced to a land that has nothing. I mean, there's nothing to grow there. This is not the place where I used to live. They don't have rivers. They don't have fish. They, in their practices of ritual, they use mud and car oil because there's no more the plants or the substances that they used to wear. They refuse to speak Portuguese. Some of them speak Portuguese, but they won't speak Portuguese to you. There's one person who will translate. And they are one of the most culturally active, in the sense that they have kept the language, they have kept their way of doing things. And what I want to talk about is this story. This is Toninho. He was a pazer. Pazer is like a shaman, but shaman is again a word identified with a Russian practice that then was exported to every person in the whole world for indigenous communities that does spiritual activities. Well, in Brazil, pazer is the word that is used. He killed himself last year because he thought that he was getting too old, so his abilities as a pazer were not going to be sufficient for the community. So he had to kill himself because he had to let somebody else take their place to do the job properly. And he killed himself with the string of his bow, right? The Maxacali, like some other indigenous peoples in Brazil, some, not all, do something like, which is similar to what you said with the fire. When somebody dies, you destroy everything that the person owns. You don't keep it. I mean, keeping something brings the absence, makes the absence present, so it brings the pain. So that you don't keep things. So, for example, having these things in the museum is an affront against their habits and their ways. There are cultures that keep things, there are cultures that don't keep things, and I think that's important to to take into account. And memory works differently. Memory doesn't work through the object. But his family donated 3 things to the Museum of Indigenous People in Rio, which is the bow that he killed himself with, another bow that he was making, the arrows, and then some feathers and tar that he used to transform himself into a creature, which is part of the shamanic process. And I was like wondering, why on earth they did that? They did 2 things that are completely contradictory. They did the thing that they do, they destroyed everything else, and then they gave us whites something else, and something really important. So they have both logics in their hands. And I mean, they could say, oh, they are just confused, but I think that would be patronizing. And I thought that, they had been in touch with that museum because they have made an exhibition of the photographs there, and I thought that, this could be read as a challenge, I mean, they are to continue to do their own things, but they know that there's some context in which they don't have full intervention power, and they are giving things, but not anything. They're not giving the pan, they're giving the weapons, they're giving the arrows and the bow to the white museum, to the Indian museum, which is run by whites, in order for them to use them. But how can you use an arrow and a bow if it's not fighting with it? And I think that there's something to learn there. I think there's something to learn about their ability to actually engage with a process of cultural maintenance without change, that they engage in their context radically for years, for thousands of years, after 500 years of colonial rule. And they are also able to engage in the logic of us, of those who are getting rid of their livelihood, and in order to actually challenge us to do something for them. And I think that those 2 things together seem to me to offer a really interesting model of operating. Because exchange is possible completely, but also maintenance of things, and also maintenance against huge power of occupation and violence that is thrown at them every day. And I wanted to finish with that there.
Thank you, Pablo. So we're going to just have a discussion now.